The air that morning had the crisp bite of late autumn, the kind that stung the skin but made every breath taste sharp and clean. The trees along the trail had already surrendered most of their leaves, carpeting the ground in a mosaic of gold and rust. Mara pulled her jacket tighter around her and quickened her pace to keep up with her father, Daniel, whose long strides always seemed just out of reach. "Slow down," she called, her voice catching in the cool air. "You're not 20 anymore." Daniel glanced back with a grin that made the deep creases at the corners of his eyes fold in familiar ways. "You'll miss the good light if you keep dragging your feet." He was talking about photography. Again, about capturing the perfect shot before the sun climbed too high. It was a habit they shared, something he'd passed on to her when she was little. The patience to wait for the right moment. The discipline to notice what others walked past. They reached an outcropping that overlooked the valley below. Clung stubbornly to the tops of the pines, and the sun's first fingers of light reached through, igniting the edges in pale gold. Mara pulled her camera from her bag. "Stay there," she told him, adjusting the focus. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, the wind ruffling his hair. For a second, he didn't look like her father, the man who always knew what to say, who could fix anything with his hands, but like someone younger, lighter, freer. She snapped the shot. "That's the one," she said. Daniel stepped closer, and without asking, took the camera from her hands. "One with both of us," he insisted, setting it on a flat rock and using the timer. He looped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She could feel the steady weight of him beside her, the faint scent of pine, and his old leather jacket. The shutter clicked. Their last smile was frozen in that frame. When the timer ended, Daniel didn't hand the camera back immediately. Instead, he nodded toward a narrow trail branching off the main path. It twisted between boulders, partly hidden by undergrowth. "Haven't been that way before," he said. Mara hesitated. She liked their familiar loop, the one that took them past the ridge and back into town before noon. The side trail disappeared quickly into shadow. "It doesn't look safe," she murmured. Daniel smiled without answering and started walking. He didn't look back this time. The trail narrowed, and the ground grew slick with damp moss. Branches clawed at their jackets. Somewhere far below, water rushed over unseen rocks, its steady roar growing louder the deeper they went. Mara kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the trees to close behind them. "Dad, where does this even lead?" "Adventure, kiddo," he said lightly. But there was something in his voice tightness, beneath the playfulness. They walked for what felt like hours, though her watch said it had been less than 30 minutes. The air grew colder. The sunlight barely pierced the canopy. And then, just ahead, the trees broke, revealing the cliff's edge. The drop was sheer. The valley sprawling below in a quilt of green and shadow. The river cut through it like a vein, churning white where it met the rocks. Mara stepped back instinctively. Daniel stood close to the edge, peering down. "Incredible view, isn't it?" She didn't answer. Her hands were cold, and she realized. She'd been gripping the strap of her camera so tightly her knuckles ached. What happened next came in fragments. Daniel turning suddenly, his eyes sharp. A voice low, unfamiliar coming from the trees behind them. Her father speaking in a tone she'd never heard before. Words she couldn't catch, too fast, too urgent. A shadow between the trunks. And then nothing. When her senses cleared, the cliff's edge was empty. Her father was gone. The voice was gone. The only sound was the river, endlessly devouring itself on the rocks. "Mara?" the call came from. Far away, or maybe just from inside her own head. She took one unsteady step, toward the edge, then another. The drop was dizzying. Her camera was no longer in her hands. She didn't remember letting go. By the time she stumbled back into town, the sun was low. Boots were caked in mud. She couldn't remember walking the whole way. At the police station, she sat shivering in the hard plastic chair, answering the same questions over and over. "What happened to your father?" He slipped, I think. "I don't know." "I didn't. See? What about the camera? Her fingers curled into her palms. It fell. I don't remember where. Her story wavered under the weight of their stares, but she stuck to it. An accident. The trail was dangerous. She didn't know. The man's voice. Maybe she'd imagined it. The search went on for days, rescue teams combing the cliff base, divers dragging the river. They found nothing. No body, no camera. Only an old thermos with Daniel's initials wedged under a root near the trailhead. In town, the whispers started. They said the trail she'd taken wasn't on any official map. That she'd come back without a scratch, but wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. That maybe she hadn't wanted to be found. Either some claimed they'd heard about a fight that father and daughter had been seen arguing the night before. Others muttered about debts Daniel owed, people he'd crossed. Mara kept her head down. She went back to school, finished her final year without speaking to most of her classmates. She learned to live with the sound of the river in her dreams. The police report eventually closed with the words presumed accidental fall. No evidence of foul play. No body recovered. But the cliffside woods remembered. Every year on that date, Mara avoided the trail entirely. She'd stay indoors, draw the curtains, and pretend the day didn't exist. And yet when she closed her eyes, she always saw the same thing, the last photo. The way her father's arm had felt around her, the warmth of that smile just before. He led her somewhere she hadn't wanted to go. 5 years later, she would remember all of this again, every detail, every shadow, every whispered word, when the knock came on her door. A knock that would bring back the cliffs, the camera, and the last smile. The knock came just as the kettle began to whistle. Mara froze in the middle of her small kitchen, one hand resting on the counter. The steam curled up from the spout, filling the air with the faint scent of chamomile, but she didn't move to pour it. The sound of knuckles against wood was steady, deliberate, not the hurried tap of a delivery driver or the careless thud of a neighbor. She wasn't expecting anyone. She never was. It was her ritual, especially on this day, the anniversary. She didn't work, didn't step outside. The curtains stayed drawn, the phone silenced, the television off. It was the one day she allowed herself to do nothing but exist, and even that felt like too much. The knock came again. Mara's chest tightened. She considered ignoring it, but whoever it was seemed patient, persistent. Finally, she crossed the living room, each step slow. She opened the door just enough to see the man standing there. Detective Rowan looked older than she remembered. Hair, once thick and dark, was now a streaked mix of gray and silver, and his face carried the wear of someone who had spent too many years chasing things he'd never quite caught. He wasn't in uniform anymore, just a worn brown jacket and a scarf pulled loose around his neck. "Hello, Mara," he said quietly, his breath clouding in the cool morning air. She stared at him for a long moment. Her mind caught between recognition and disbelief. "You're not with the police anymore." "No," he said, shaking his head. "Retired. 3 years now." "Then why are you here?" His eyes softened, but his voice didn't lose its weight. "Because something's come up. About your father." She didn't invite him in right away. The silence between them stretched until it became almost unbearable. Rowan didn't fill it. He simply waited, hands in his jacket pockets, as though he had all the time in the world. Finally, Mara stepped back, letting the door open wider. He entered without looking around, but she could feel his eyes noting the neatness of her apartment, the absence of personal photographs, the walls stripped of anything that might reveal too much. "Tea?" she asked out of habit. "Coffee, if you have it." She didn't. They settled at the small table in the corner, the kettle still warm enough for her to pour. She set a cup in front of him, then sat opposite, her hands curling around her own mug for warmth. Rowan didn't drink. He studied her for a moment, then said, 5 days ago. A rock climber reported finding something unusual lodged in a cliff face along the North Ridge. Mara's fingers tightened around her cup. The name of the place was like ice water in her veins. She had avoided it for 5 years. "It was a camera," Rowan continued. "A rusted one, badly weathered. But the serial number matched one reported. Missing in your father's case file? It's his. Mara said nothing. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. We've managed to extract the memory card, Rowan went on. Most of it's damaged, but a few images remain, I thought. You should know before I hand them over to the department. Her hands trembled slightly, the tea rippling in her cup. Why? She asked. He frowned. Why tell you? She said, her voice sharper than she meant. Why now? Why after all this time? Rowan leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window, where thin winter light seeped between the curtains. Because the timing feels wrong. Things like this don't just appear after 5 years without reason. Someone wanted it found. She hated the way that sentence crawled under her skin. The image of the cliff came rushing back, wind in her face. The roar of the river below, her father's sudden turn toward the shadow in the trees. She'd spent years burying it, locking the memory in a box she never opened. Now Rowan was here, digging it back up. I don't want to see them, she said flatly. I think you should. No, he didn't push further, but his eyes told her he would be back. They sat in silence for a while. The only sound the occasional clink of his spoon against the ceramic as he stirred his tea without drinking it. Finally he stood. I'll give you a day, he said. Think about it. I'll be at the old station tomorrow morning. You know where to find me? At the door he paused, looking at her with a mixture of pity and determination. No, you've tried to move on. But this is your father's last moments. Don't you want to know the truth? She didn't answer. After he left, Mara closed the door and leaned against it, her palms pressed to the wood. The apartment felt colder somehow. She carried her tea to the counter, set it down untouched, and went to her bedroom in the closet. Behind a stack of folded sweaters was the shoebox. She pulled it out slowly, as though it might bite. Inside were the only family photographs she had kept, the faded Polaroids from her childhood. Her mother's smile from a time before she'd left, and snapshots of hiking trips with her father. The last one was different. It wasn't from that day on the cliff. She had no copy of that. But it was close. Daniel standing near a trailhead, grinning, his arm draped over her shoulder. Her throat tightened. She placed the photo face down, closed the box, and shoved it back into the dark. That night, she dreamed of the river. It was louder than she remembered, churning with a violence that seemed almost alive. Camera heavy in her hands, the wind tugged at her hair. Below, the water writhed, swallowing something dark, something that looked like a man's jacket. When she turned to step back, there was Rowan, standing where her father had stood that day. His mouth moved, but she couldn't hear him over the roar. And then she woke. Breathless, the darkness of her apartment pressing in. The morning came gray and muted. Mara moved through her routine like a ghost shower. Dress, tea. The streets outside glistened with last night's rain. She was halfway through arranging a new display of books at the shop when the bell over the door chimed. She looked up to see Rowan again, his expression unreadable. You thought about it? He asked. She didn't answer immediately. She glanced toward the street, then back at him. Finally, she nodded once, the smallest motion. Rowan's shoulders eased. Good. Tomorrow morning, then, we'll look at them together. He left without another word. Mara stood in the quiet shop for a long time after, her hands resting on the counter, her heart pounding with the knowledge that whatever was on that camera, it was about to change everything. The next morning came. Wrapped in a haze that made the whole town look like it was holding its breath, Mara walked to the old station with her hood pulled low, the damp air clinging to her hair. She hadn't been inside the building since she was 17, since the day they told her the case was closed. Even then, it had smelled of coffee gone bitter and paper gone stale. Rowan was already there, leaning against the counter. Manila envelope sat in front of him. He didn't touch it, but his eyes never strayed far from it. You came, he said simply. She kept her voice low. Let's get this over with. Wait. They sat at a table in a small side room where the blinds were half closed, letting in only thin slashes of morning light. The envelope lay between them like something alive. Rowan tapped it once, as though measuring the weight of what he was about to say. A rock climber named Dean Sutter was scaling the east face of North Ridge 2 weeks ago. Rowan began. Said he saw something glinting from a crevice about 40 feet up. When he pried it out, it turned out to be this. He slid a photograph across the table. It showed a camera corroded, the black casing eaten away in patches, the metal edges pitted with rust. But the shape was still recognizable, and even in its ruined state, Mara knew it. That's, her voice caught, Daniels, Rowan. Finished for her. Serial number matches the one you reported missing. Somehow, the position it was in shielded it from the worst of the weather. We managed to remove the memory card without shattering it. Mara stared at the photo of the camera. It looked wrong, like a part of her life she'd buried had been dug up and left to rot in the open. I don't want to see what's on it, she said. Finally, Rowan didn't look surprised. Why not? Because nothing on there will change what happened. He's gone. That's it. His gaze hardened just slightly. Or maybe it will prove what happened. Mara, you've been living in a fog for 5 years. What if this clears it? She met his eyes. Or makes it worse. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a car drove past, its tires hissing on the wet pavement. Rowan leaned forward. I've seen cases like this. Sometimes the smallest detail in a photo, the angle of a shadow, the direction someone's looking, can unravel the whole truth. This isn't just about your father. Something happened that day that wasn't an accident. Mara's stomach twisted. You think someone was there? I think you do, he said softly. And I think you've known it all along. Hands were cold against the tabletop. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she'd imagined the voice in the woods, that memory was unreliable after shock. But the truth was, every time she tried to replay that day, her mind caught on the same jagged edge, her father's sudden change in tone, the dark figure between the trees. The way her camera had slipped from her hands without her remembering how. She closed her eyes briefly. If I agree to see them, will you drop this after? Rowan didn't promise. We'll see. By the time they left the station, the haze had thickened into a fine mist. Mara walked home without speaking, her hands buried deep in her pockets. The envelope stayed with Rowan. She didn't want it in her apartment, contaminating the fragile space she'd built for herself at her front door. She paused, glancing up and down the street. Everything looked normal. Empty sidewalks closed. Shutters, but the hairs on her neck rose anyway. She unlocked the door quickly and slipped inside. Locking it behind her, the apartment felt too quiet. She went to the kitchen and filled the kettle, letting the familiar sound of water calm her. But as she reached for a mug, her gaze fell to the drawer beside the stove. She opened it slowly. Inside, beneath a tangle of old takeout menus and mismatched cutlery, was a folded envelope. Yellowed. The paper thin from years of being handled, her fingers hovered above it for a moment before she picked it up. The handwriting on the front was her father's. She had found the letter a week after he disappeared, tucked inside his old hiking jacket. That the search team had returned. She had never shown it to the police, never told anyone it existed. She'd read it once, in a trembling voice to the empty apartment, and then tucked it away where it couldn't hurt her. Now, holding it again, the paper seemed heavier. She didn't read it this time. She didn't need to. The words had been burned into her memory years ago. If you're reading this, something went wrong. Don't trust the trail. Don't trust who follows. Mara stood very still, the kettle beginning to scream behind her. Then, slowly, she walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and dropped the letter inside. The water darkened the paper instantly, the ink bleeding into black smudges. She reached for the matchbook from the counter, struck one, and let it fall. Flame hissed and flared, curling the edges into brittle ash. The smoke rose in thin, spiraling lines. Carrying away the last trace of her father's warning, when the fire was out, she rinsed the sink clean, the ashes swirling down the drain. She turned off the kettle without pouring the tea. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the wind pressing against the windows, each creak of the old building making her muscles tense. At some point, she thought she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. But when she sat up and strained to listen, there was only silence. Morning came slow, the light pale and watery. Mara dressed mechanically, pulling on her thickest sweater, then stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Someone bracing for a storm. At 9, she met Rowan outside the station. He held the manila envelope under his arm. "You ready?" he asked. She didn't answer, but she followed him inside. The photo lab was small, tucked between a boarded-up antique shop and a cafe that smelled of burnt espresso. It hadn't changed in years, its yellowing sign, the faint chemical temps inside, the hum of old fluorescent lights. Mara stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly, as Detective Rowan slid the envelope onto the counter with a kind of reverence. "They're ready," he said quietly, though the shop was empty except for them and the hunched lab. Clerk Mara's throat felt dry. Her mind replayed the last 24 hours, Rowan showing up on her doorstep. The weight in his voice, the way she had burned that letter after he left. She didn't want to be here. But she also knew she wouldn't have been able to sleep until she saw what the camera had captured. The clerk returned, placing a neat stack of glossy prints onto the counter. The images were still faintly warm, as though they'd been pulled straight from the machine. Rowan didn't hand them over right away. Instead, he gave Mara a searching, "Look, are you sure you want to see these?" She nodded, though she wasn't. The first photo was ordinary enough: Daniel standing on the cliff trail, squinting against the late afternoon sun. His hair was tousled, his smile easy. Mara's chest tightened. The second was a panorama of the ocean below, a spray of white foam frozen mid-crash against the black rocks. She remembered that day in flashes, the wind tangling her hair, the sound of gulls, Daniel's voice teasing her for being too cautious near the edge. The third showed Mara herself. "What?" caught mid-laugh. She hadn't known he'd taken it. Her cheeks burned now, seeing that unguarded version of herself, one that felt like a stranger. Rowan turned to the next image. The shift was subtle at first: Daniel again, but this time his expression was less carefree. He was mid-sentence, lips slightly parted, eyes not quite on the camera, and then the final photo. It was as if the air in the shop had changed temperature. Daniel stood at the same spot, but his smile had collapsed into something uncertain, confused, almost wary. Behind him, wedged between two jagged boulders, was a shadow. Not just any shadow, but a silhouette. Tall, human-shaped, its head slightly tilted as if watching. No features, no color, only darkness where there should have been light. Rowan leaned closer, his brows knitting. "It wasn't caused by the sun," he murmured. Mara couldn't answer. Her eyes locked on the curve of that shadowed form, the suggestion of shoulders, the way it seemed to lean forward. A strange ringing filled her ears. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said under her breath. Rowan's head snapped toward her. "What do you mean?" But Mara's gaze stayed on the print. She felt as though she were being pulled into it, the glossy surface stretching out like water beneath ice. Her mind swirled with fragments: Daniel's voice, the sound of something shifting behind them that day, smell she could never place. Rowan reached out, covering the photo with his palm. "Mara." His voice was sharper now, grounding. "Tell me what you remember." She blinked, the ringing fading. "Nothing," she lied. "You muttered something I don't remember." Her tone was flat, final. She grabbed her coat, her movements brisk, as if speed could keep the truth from catching up. Outside, the street was bright. The kind of brittle winter sunlight that made every shadow seem sharper. She walked fast, the photo still in her hand. Rowan following a few steps behind. "You're not telling me everything," he said. She didn't look at him. "You think a 5-year-old camera found in a cliff is going to solve anything? Daniel's gone. Whatever happened, it's over." Stopped walking. "Things don't just happen on their own, Mara. That shadow someone was there." The words lodged in her chest. She turned the corner toward her apartment, refusing to slow down, but his voice carried after her. "If you know something." "Even if it's small, I don't," she snapped. without turning back. Her building's front door closed behind her with a hollow thud. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, unlocked her apartment, and shut herself inside. Only then did she let her knees weaken. Sinking onto the couch, she spread the photos out on the coffee table. One by one, she stared at them again, lingering. Longest on the last, the shadow seemed darker now, as though it had absorbed some of her unease. Her reflection hovered faintly over the glossy surface. Almost merging with the darkness, Mara reached into the drawer beside the couch. Pulling out the small tin box where she kept things she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away Daniel's watch, a dried sprig of lavender, a faded ferry ticket. She slid the final photo inside, shutting the lid with a quiet click. Her phone buzzed on the armrest. Unknown number. She ignored it. It buzzed again. This time a text appeared. You remember? More than you're saying. She stared at the screen until the letters blurred. A third buzz followed, the message simple and cold. He saw me that day. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She rose and yanked the curtains closed, plunging the room into dimness. Outside, a car passed slowly, its engine low and steady, before disappearing around the corner. She locked the door, then double-checked the chain. The photos still lay scattered on the table, except for the last one, now hidden in the tin. For the first time in years, Mara wished she had never agreed to see Rowan. She didn't know if the shadow was still out there, but she knew without a doubt it hadn't finished with her yet. Rowan didn't sleep that night. The image of the dark silhouette behind Daniel kept looping in his mind like a film reel with a single frame burned into it. At 3:17 a.m., pushed aside the stack of old case files on his desk and typed a few keywords into the State Archive search bar. It was a long shot, but the name he eventually stumbled on, Elias Vance, wouldn't leave him. The report was faded. Scanned from an old typewriter form, Elias had vanished 11 years before Daniel. The last confirmed sighting placed him on the exact same trail Daniel had hiked the day he disappeared. No witnesses, no body. It's just an abandoned backpack found by a forest ranger 3 months later, its contents waterlogged and stripped of anything useful. Rowan printed the file and stared at the black and white photo clipped to the top corner. Elias was younger than Rowan had expected, maybe early 30s. With angular features and eyes that seemed to look through the camera instead of at it. When Rowan met Mara at the small diner on Main the next morning, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon greeted him like a slap. She was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. He slid the folder onto the table without a word. Mara's eyes flicked to it, then away. What's that? Someone else who vanished, Rowan said quietly. Elias Vance. Last seen near Red Hollow Trail. Same day of the year as Daniel. 11 years earlier, as she stiffened, her knuckles whitening around the mug. Coincidence? Maybe. He opened the folder, sliding the grainy photos toward her. Recognize him? Her gaze lingered on the picture for less than a heartbeat before she shook her head. Too quickly, no. Rowan studied her, but she was already looking out the window, watching the drizzle bead against the glass. I think he might be the man in that last photo, Rowan continued, his voice low. The silhouette, the proportions match. The way his shoulders slope. Mara finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. You've been staring at that picture too long. You're starting to see ghosts. Later, alone in her kitchen, the name Elias Vance rolled through Mara's mind like a loose marble. She tried to busy herself washing dishes, folding laundry, but the memories came anyway, uninvited and jagged at the edges. It had been late. Afternoon, when she and Daniel reached the clearing that day, the air was heavy with the scent of wet pine. Daniel had gone ahead to set up the camera on the tripod, calling back to her to hurry up before the light changes. And then her father's voice. It had come from deeper in the woods, sharp and low, the way he spoke when he didn't want to be overheard. Mara had frozen, half hidden behind a tree, watching as he stepped into view. He wasn't alone. The other Mantal, with a dark jacket and a face partially obscured by shadows, stood stiffly across from him. Even now, Mara couldn't remember their exact words, only the tension in them, the way they both kept glancing toward Daniel. Her father's jaw had tightened. The other man had taken a slow step closer. Then the memory fractured, slipping through her grasp like water. In the present, Mara pressed her palms to the counter until her fingers ached. She told herself it wasn't important, that she was just remembering wrong. But the truth was gnawing at her in the silence between thoughts. Back at his office, Rowan spread the photographs across the desk again, placing the old missing persons report beside them. Something about the overlap was too neat, too deliberate. Elias Vance's trail had ended abruptly. Just like Daniel's, he dug deeper. Local forums, digitized microfilm of newspapers from the year Elias vanished. An article in the Crescent Valley Gazette caught his eye. Search ends for missing woodsman. The accompanying photo showed the rescue team at the base of a cliff. The caption mentioned the same jagged rock formation visible in one of Daniel's earlier shots. Rowan's phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. Stop digging. Some things are better left buried. He stared at the message until the screen dimmed. The next day, he found himself driving the long, winding road out to Red Hollow. The forest loomed taller here, the canopy knitting overhead like a net. The trailhead was damp from last night's rain, the earth smelling of rotten moss. Half a mile in, Rowan reached the point where the path forked. The left trail led toward the cliff overlook where the rock climber had found Daniel's camera. The right one, according to the old map, curved deeper into the valley. He hesitated, then turned right. The trees grew denser, the light thinner. At one point, he thought he heard a branch snap behind him, but when he turned, the path was empty. 100 yards later, he found it. A clearing choked with ferns, the remnants of a campfire at its center. Above the ash and char, something gleamed. Faintly. Rowan knelt, brushing away damp leaves to reveal a tarnished belt buckle. He flipped it over and his stomach tightened. Engraved on the back were the initials. Evie Mara's voice echoed in his memory from the diner. Coincidence? But when Rowan straightened, scanning the tree line, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him from just beyond the reach of the light. That night, Mara dreamt of the woods. In her dream, she stood in the same clearing, the air thick and unmoving. Elias Vance was there, half in shadow, his eyes fixed on her. You know what happened? He said, though his lips didn't move. You've always known. She woke gasping, the sheets twisted around her legs. The smell of smoke lingered. Faintly, though there was no fire in the house. By morning, she had made a decision. If Rowan wanted answers, she'd give him part of the truths, just enough to make him stop digging before he found the rest. But Rowan was already on his way to her. The belt buckle in his pocket, and the conviction that whatever had happened to Elias Vance was the key to unraveling everything about Daniel's disappearance. And somewhere, deep in the woods, a pair of eyes watched and waited. The cafe was tucked away on a side street, its small windows fogged from the steam of the espresso machine inside. Outside, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, leaving the pavement dark and slick. Rowan held the door open for Mara, who hesitated on the threshold before stepping in. The faint chime above the door rang softly, a strangely comforting sound. In the otherwise heavy air between them, they chose a corner booth. Far enough from the other patrons to avoid being overheard, the space was dimly lit. The single hanging bulb above their table, casting long shadows that swayed gently with every flicker. A waitress in a faded apron poured them both tea without being asked. Rowan waited until the waitress moved, way before leaning forward. His voice was low, deliberate. Mara, I'm not here to accuse you. I think you know more than you've been telling me. Her fingers wrapped around the chipped mug, holding it like a lifeline. She didn't meet his eyes, for a moment. The only sound was the quiet clink of her spoon stirring the tea. Then she set it down and spoke in a voice so soft Rowan almost missed it. You're right, he stilled. Go on. Mara's gaze drifted to the window, watching raindrops snake down the glass. Daniel wasn't the man you think he was, she said. And he wasn't the man I thought he was either. Rowan frowned. Meaning? She took a slow breath, as if each word carried weight. When we first met, he was charming, funny, adventurous. I thought we had the same restless streak. But he had. Debts. Bad ones. He owed money to people you don't say no to. And worse, he had a history with Elias Vance's family. Rowan's stomach tightened. Elias, the missing man from the reports? Yes. She glanced at him briefly, then looked away again. Elias wasn't just some hiker who vanished. His family owned land out past the ridge, or quiet. People kept to themselves, but everyone knew not to cross them. Years ago, Daniel, he got involved with Elias's sister. At first it was just a fling, but it turned ugly. There were accusations. A fight. One night Elias showed up at Daniel's place demanding answers. It didn't end well. Rowan leaned back, the image of the silhouette from the photo flashing in his mind. What happened to Elias? I don't know, Mara said quickly, almost too quickly. But after that night, he was gone. His family stopped talking to anyone. And Daniel, he pretended it was all behind him, but I could tell he was always looking over his shoulder. The warmth of the tea had long since cooled in Rowan's hands. So when Daniel took that trail, the same one Elias disappeared in, you didn't think it was just for the scenery. Her lips pressed into a thin line. No, I think he was going back to settle something. Or maybe someone wanted to settle it for him. Hey. Rowan let the silence stretch. The hum of conversation from the other tables felt distant, muffled, as if they were sitting in a sealed room. Mara, he said at last, the day Daniel disappeared. In the woods? What really happened? She flinched, as though the question had physically struck her. I told you before we were hiking. He went ahead to take photos, and she stopped herself, her voice cracking. Her hand shook slightly as she lifted her tea. That's not the whole truth. Rowan's gaze didn't waver. I heard voices, she whispered. Not Daniel's. I followed the sound and saw him with someone I didn't recognize. At first, they were arguing. It was heated. Then I realized it was Elias's father. Rowan's breath caught, but Elias's father would be old. Yes, but strong enough and angry enough. She closed her eyes briefly, as though trying to block out the memory. I couldn't hear every word, but it was about money, something Daniel had taken. I stayed hidden. Then Daniel saw me. He looked scared. Not for himself. Scared. That I was there. He told me to go back to the trail. I didn't. I saw them walk toward the rocks, and that's when I lost sight of them. Rowan's mind was already spinning with the implications. You didn't tell anyone this before? I tried, she said bitterly. But who would believe me? Elias was already gone. Daniel was missing. And if I said Elias's family might be involved, well, they have a way of making problems disappear. I wasn't ready to be the next one. The bulb above them flickered, casting brief moments of darkness over their table. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain again. Blurring the street lights into hazy globes, Rowan studied her carefully. You realize this changes everything. If Elias's father was there, if there was a confrontation, then Daniel didn't just vanish, Mara finished for him, her voice hollow. Something happened, and I think someone wanted it to be forgotten. She reached into her bag and slid something across the table. It was an old photograph, edges worn from years of handling. In it, Daniel stood in front of a cabin. Arms slung around a young woman Rowan didn't recognize. But his eyes were on the camera, intense, almost defiant. That's Elise's sister, Mara said. In that cabin? It's on their property. I think Daniel went back there before. He disappeared. If you want answers, that's where you'll find them. Rowan stared at the photograph, feeling the weight of its unspoken history. The rain outside seemed louder now, as if urging him to move before the trail went cold. Mara's voice softened. Rowan, be careful. They don't forgive, and they don't forget. He pocketed the photograph, already knowing what he had to do next. But as he stood to leave, he noticed Mara's hands trembling, not from the chill in the cafe, but from something deeper. Something told him she hadn't told him everything. Outside, the rain greeted him with a cold slap, soaking into his coat. As he stepped onto the slick pavement, the photograph felt like a live coal in his pocket, burning with questions and the ghost of a past no one wanted to exhume. He glanced back through the cafe window just once. Mara was still in the booth, staring at her untouched tea, the hanging bulb swinging slightly above her head. Rowan turned away, heading toward his car. The cabin awaited on with it. The kind of answers that never came without a price. The bell over the diner door jingled, but no one paid much attention until the figure stepped inside. She wasn't dressed like the rest of the locals, no puffy jackets or faded jeans. Instead, she wore a fitted black coat that fell just below the knee, the collar pulled up against the wind. Her eyes scanned the room in a way that made Rowan instantly alert. She didn't look lost. She looked like she was searching. "Mara Linton?" the woman asked, her voice calm but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the diner's chatter. Mara turned, a frown forming before she could help it. "Do I know you?" The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking against the worn tile. "Claire Vance." She said it like Mara was supposed to recognize the name. Rowan did. He'd seen it buried in one of the older missing persons files. Vance's sister. But according to the record, she'd moved out of state years ago, cutting ties with the family after Elias vanished. "What brings you to Grayford?" Rowan asked carefully, his hand tightening around his coffee mug. Claire's gaze flicked to him, then back to Mara. "You were the last person to see my brother alive. I want to know what you remember." The words dropped between them like a stone. Mara stiffened. I already told the police everything years ago." Claire smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. "I'm not asking about what you told them. I'm asking about what you left out." Rowan glanced at Mara, noting the way her shoulders tensed, the way she avoided eye contact. Something in her body language confirmed Claire's suspicion there were things Mara hadn't said. "Maybe this isn't the place," Rowan suggested. But Claire shook her head. "No, this will do." She slid into the booth across from Mara, without waiting for permission. "Daniel, your boyfriend. He wasn't who you thought he was." Mara's eyes narrowed. "You think I don't know that?" "I think you don't know the half of it," Claire replied smoothly. "He had a history with my family. My brother was stable before Daniel. He had a job, plans to leave town, maybe even a chance at something better. Then Daniel came along, and everything went to hell." Mara's stomach nodded. "You're blaming him for Elias disappearing?" Claire leaned in, her tone lowering. "I'm saying Daniel owed my brother money, a lot of it. And when he couldn't pay, he offered something else instead. A job, a favor. Whatever it was, it broke him. You think you were the only one? Daniel lied too? He made promises to Elias too? Promises that cost him everything." Rowan's pen was already out, notes forming in tight, deliberate script. "What kind of favor?" Claire's lips pressed into a thin line.
Ow.
"If I knew that, maybe my brother wouldn't have vanished." The conversation drew glances from nearby tables. Mara felt the walls closing in, the air in the diner thickening. "Why are you telling me this now? After all these years?" Claire's gaze hardened. "Because you've been walking around this town as if you're a victim." "Maybe you were. But if you had disappeared that day instead of Elias, it might have been justice." Mara flinched. "Justice? You don't know the damage Daniel caused," Claire said. "To me, to Elias. 2 more people than you can imagine." The silence that followed was brittle. Rowan finally broke it. "Do you have proof of any of this? Something we can verify?" Claire reached into her coat pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Mara hesitated before picking it up. It was an old photo, Daniel and Elias standing together outside a cabin. Daniel's arm was draped casually over Elias's shoulder, but Elias wasn't smiling. His eyes were narrowed, his jaw tight. The date in the corner was just 3 weeks before Elias vanished. When Mara looked up, Claire was already sliding out of the booth. "I'll be in town for a few days. Find me if you decide you're ready to stop pretending." She left without another word, the bell over the door ringing in her wake. Rowan exhaled slowly. Well, that was something. Mara's hands trembled as she set the photo down. "She's lying," maybe Rowan said. Or maybe she just told us the part of the truth that suits her. Mara's pulse wouldn't slow. She kept seeing Elias's unsmiling face in that photo, kept hearing Claire's voice saying that her disappearance would have been justice. That night, Mara tried to push it all aside. But when she returned to her small apartment, something stopped her cold. There, on the floor just inside her door, was an envelope. She picked it up slowly, noticing there was no name, no address, just her. Inside was a single photograph. It was black and white, slightly grainy. The angle was odd, taken from somewhere. Low and hidden. It showed her walking through the edge of the woods near Hollow Creek. She didn't remember anyone being there that day. A chill swept through her, deeper than the winter wind outside. She checked the lock on her door twice before sitting on the couch. The photo still clutched in her hand. The next morning, another envelope appeared. This one was slid under her door while she was still asleep. It was another photograph. This time, it was her at the cafe with Rowan, taken the day before. Her mind raced. Whoever was doing this wasn't just digging into her past. They were watching her now. The police report arrived early that morning. A crisp manila envelope slid under Rowan's office door, while the rest of the station was still wrapped in the drowsy quiet of dawn. He found Mara, already there, perched in the chair across from his desk. Arms folded tightly as though bracing against a storm she couldn't see but could feel in her bones. He didn't say anything at first, just slit the envelope open, scanning the forensics report until the words snagged like thorns. Dried blood, found embedded in the jagged face of the cliff, just a few feet from where the rusted camera had been wedged. 2 DNA profiles, one belonging to Daniel Harker. Other, Elias Vance. Mara's head snapped up when Rowan's expression darkened. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked quietly. "It's complicated," Rowan replied, sliding the paper toward her. He watched her eyes move over the lines, her knuckles tightening until they blanched. The connection between Daniel and Elias was no longer just whispered speculation. It was carved into stone, permanent as the cliff itself. Whatever had happened that day, it had drawn blood from both men. 2 men. To blood samples, Mara murmured, her voice trembling. "That means they were there together." Rowan nodded. "And it wasn't just an accident." "That amount of blood," he trailed off, unwilling to finish. The cliff didn't forgive. Outside, gulls screamed against the gray morning sky, their cries thin and sharp like glass splintering in the air. Mara stared at the window, her mind drifting back to that week, the sharp salt smell. The wind pressing against her, Daniel's voice in her ear telling her to stay back from the edge. She had thought he was protecting her. Now she wondered, if he was protecting himself? "You need to be careful, Mara," Rowan said finally. "Gosh." This, he gestured to the report, puts you in the middle of something that hasn't ended. Her gaze returned to him, steady and strange. "Already in the middle, Rowan? Pretending otherwise won't keep me safe?" "Mara, I'm going back there," she interrupted, her voice steel over glass. "To the cliffs." His brows furrowed. "That's the worst place you could be right now." "It's the only place I can face this," she countered. "Every answer I've gotten so far has been in pieces. Maybe standing where it happened will show me the whole picture." Rohan leaned back in his chair, studying her. He had seen people make reckless choices in the name of closure. But something about Mara's tone told him this wasn't just recklessness. It was inevitability. "If you go," said slowly, "I'll go with you." "Not as a cop," said someone. "Who doesn't want to read your name in another report like this?" For a moment, she softened. "Thank you." They parted in silence, the weight of the report sitting like an unspoken third presence between them. That night Mara couldn't sleep. Rain tapped against her window in uneven rhythms, and every shadow in the corners of her room seemed too deep, too still. She sat up at 2 a.m., pulling the old quilt tighter around her shoulders, staring at the dark outline of the trees outside. She'd almost convinced herself to lie back down when it began the dream. In it, she stood in the woods near the cliffs. The air damp and heavy. The ground was soft beneath her feet, muffled with fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the ocean pounding against the rocks, each crash echoing through the earth. "Mara." "Dal." The voice came low and familiar, curling through the trees like smoke. Her father's voice. She turned, searching between the trunks, but the forest was an endless repetition of gray and black. "Mara, It called again. Closer now. Come here. She took a step forward, then another, her breath catching as the shadows shifted ahead. For a moment she thought. She saw him, his jacket, his posture, the tilt of his head exactly as she remembered. But the moment she tried to move faster, the figure slipped away, deeper into the woods. She followed, the undergrowth snagging her clothes, the sound of the sea growing louder until it felt like the cliffs themselves were breathing. Then she saw something glinting on the ground. She knelt, brushing away damp leaves to reveal a dark, jagged stone. When she picked it up, her fingers came away wet. Stained deep red, the sound of the waves stopped. When she looked up, her father was gone. The forest was silent. Mara woke with a sharp gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. It took several long moments to remember where she was. The rain had stopped, but the smell of the sea still clung to her senses, and her hands trembled as though they'd truly been holding that blood-stained stone. She sat in the dark until the first pale threads of dawn touched the window. She didn't know if the dream was just a product of everything she had learned, or a warning. But either way, it had left her with a clarity she couldn't ignore by the time Rowan arrived later that morning. Mara was ready. "We go today," she told him, before he could even speak. He didn't argue. He just nodded, the lines around his eyes deepening. They drove in near silence, the road winding toward the sea. The cliffs rose in the distance like the spine of some ancient beast, jagged against the horizon. When they arrived, the wind was fierce, tearing at their jackets and sending spray high into the air. Mara stood at the edge, the same spot where the camera had been found, and stared down at the dark rocks below. Rowan stayed a few steps back, watching her closely. Somewhere, in her chest, fear and determination twisted together into something sharp. She thought of the blood embedded in the stone of Elias and Daniel, locked in some violent moment that had never been spoken of. She thought of her father's voice calling her into the woods. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't sure. If she was speaking to Rowan or to herself. Behind them, unseen in the whipping wind, a dark figure stood half-hidden among the rocks, watching. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving the town washed in a damp, metallic scent. Mara hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard her father's voice from the dream, again calling her name, dragging it out like a warning. By morning, her hands still trembled when she poured herself coffee. Rohan arrived without knocking, his jacket still slick from the mist outside. He carried the old camera like it was a piece of fragile evidence wrapped in a cloth. Mara recognized it instantly, the one pulled from the cliff, the one that had already turned their lives upside down. "Couldn't shake the feeling we missed something," he said, stepping into her kitchen. "Turns out I was right." He unwrapped the camera and set it on the table. His hands moved with care, fingers pressing against the metal edges, until a faint click sounded. From a thin compartment near the back, he slid out something tightly wedged in an undeveloped roll of film. Mara's breath hitched. That wasn't there before. It was jammed between the housing and the frame. "Easy to miss if you're not looking for it," Rowan replied, already placing it in a protective case. "I had it processed." This morning, he slid a small envelope toward her. Her pulse drummed in her ears as she opened it. The first few photos were familiar overgrown paths, jagged cliff edges, blurry shots of the sea below. But the last one made her throat tighten. It showed Elias, turned slightly as if caught mid-sentence. Standing on the cliff, behind him, just out of focus, was Mara, not Daniel, not anyone else. Mara, her face in the image, looked wrong-drained of color, eyes wide and unfocused. And in her hands, gripped tightly, was something metallic, its shape distorted by the camera's angle. "That's not." Her voice trailed off as she stared at the image, her chest constricting. "I don't remember this. I don't." Rowan watched her carefully. "Mara, this was taken minutes before he disappeared. Whoever took it wanted to make sure this frame was preserved." She shook her head, shoving the photo back toward him. "It's not real. Someone edited it." "This isn't how it happened?" Film doesn't lie, Rowan said gently. And the lab swears this negative hasn't been tampered with. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I wasn't there, not like that. Not even own anything like. Whatever that is in my hands. Rowan's eyes flicked to her. You're sure? Yes, she snapped, then softer at least. I think I'm sure. Silence settled between them, heavy and unyielding. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a gull cried. Mara's pulse refused to slow. Finally, Rowan broke the stillness. The metallic object could be anything. Tool, a piece of equipment. If you did have it, and if you were that close to Elias, it changes the timeline. Her knees felt weak, so she lowered herself back into the chair. I've gone over that day 100 times in my head. Every sound, every shadow. I would remember standing that close to him. Les Rowan said carefully. Someone made sure you wouldn't. The suggestion made her stomach twist. She thought of the headaches she'd had afterward, the blank spaces in her memory that she'd always attributed to shock. She didn't notice. Rowan taking another photo from the envelope until he placed it beside the first. It was nearly identical, just shifted slightly, as if the photographer had moved an inch to the left. In this one, Ilias's mouth was open, and her own gaze seemed fixed on something just beyond the frame, something that camera didn't capture. Her skin prickled. Who took these? She whispered. That's the question, isn't it? Rowan said. And whoever it was, they were close enough to hear everything. Mara pushed the photos away, unable to look at them any longer. What do we do with this? I'll have the metallic object enhanced digitally. Maybe we can identify it. In the meantime, I need you to think, has anyone ever mentioned seeing you with Elias that day besides Daniel? She opened her mouth to answer, but a memory surfaced, faint and slippery. Claire's voice, Justice. The way she'd looked at Mara when she said it like she knew something. Mara, D-I-D-N, toned, her hands curled into fists. Claire, she murmured. Rowan raised an eyebrow. Elias's sister. She implied things. About me. About that day. I thought it was just her trying to scare me. Rowan leaned forward. Mara, if she's connected to these photos before he could finish, a faint thud sounded from outside. Both of them turned toward the front. Mara moved cautiously, pulling it open. On the porch lay a single envelope, the paper damp from the lingering mist. No return address, no markings, just her name scrawled in jagged ink. Her fingers hesitated before tearing it open. Inside was a photograph not from the camera this time, but printed on glossy paper. It showed the same cliff, the same stretch of rock. But in this one, the metallic object in her hands was clear. It was a hammer, and there was something dark smeared across the head of it. She dropped the photo, as if it burned. Her heart slamming against her ribs. Rowan scooped it up, his jaw tightening. This isn't just about Elias anymore, he said grimly. Someone's trying to make you remember or confess. Mara's voice was barely a whisper. But what if? I already did it, and I just don't remember? Rowan didn't answer. He slipped the photo into his coat pocket, then glanced toward the street. The mist had thickened, curling between the houses like pale fingers. We need to get back to the cliffs, he said. Now before whoever left this decides to send something worse. Her mind screamed to say no, to shut the door, to lock herself inside. But another part, the part that had been gnawing at her since the dream needed to see. She nodded once, her throat dry. Let's go. Rowan gave a short, tight nod and led the way, the envelope still clutched. In his hand, Mara followed, her eyes drawn to the hammer burned into her mind. Somewhere in the fog ahead, the cliffs waited. And maybe, just maybe, the missing pieces of her memory were waiting too. The fog rolled in thick and low, curling around their ankles as Mara led Rowan along the narrow, uneven trail toward the cliffs. The air was sharp with salt, and the muted roar of waves crashing against the rocks far below made it hard to tell whether the sound was coming from above or beneath them. She kept her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, her gaze fixed ahead as if each step was pulling her into the jaws of something she could no longer avoid. Rowan walked a pace behind, scanning the path, the jagged outcrops, the dense tangle of brush that closed in around them. The camera's final image still burned in his mind, Mara's pale face, the metallic glint in her hands, Elia standing only feet away. He didn't want to believe it meant anything sinister, but there were too many unanswered questions. They reached a bend where the path narrowed to a shoulder of rock no wider than a small car. Beyond it, the cliff dropped away into a void of gray mist. Mara stopped. "This is it," she said quietly. The place where Daniel disappeared. Rowan stepped forward, careful to keep his weight centered. The stone here was streaked with darker patches, weathered but still rough, like it had once been scraped or struck. He knelt, brushing his fingertips against the cold surface, imagining the force it would take to send someone over the edge. Mara stood rigid, arms folded. It was late afternoon. The light was going. Daniel and Elias were arguing no more than arguing. They were wild, shoving, grabbing, tried to step between them. She looked out over the drop, her breath trembling. I remember Daniel stumbling. I remember Elias's hands on his jacket. And then I tried to pull Daniel back. Her voice cracked. The wind swept her hair across her face, but she didn't move to brush it away. One of them slipped. She whispered. It happened so fast, I can't tell which one started to fall first. Daniel. He just Rowan straightened, watching her closely, and then I screamed. Elias reached out, but she shook her head, swallowing hard. By the time I looked down, Daniel was gone. The water was too rough to see anything. I ran. There was a long silence. Only the sea filled it, relentless and cold. Rowan's mind worked through the fragments. Something was wrong. Mara, in the photo, you're holding something metallic. Do you remember what it was? She flinched, almost imperceptibly. No. I told you I don't remember. But you're certain you didn't have anything in your hands that could have, I don't know, she snapped, her voice rising before she turned away. I don't remember that day clearly, Rowan. I just know Daniel was my friend and I didn't hurt him. Rowan stayed still, letting her anger burn off. Sometimes, he said finally, the mind erases what it can't accept. But the truth has a way of clawing back. Her eyes met his briefly, wide and unsettled. Then she looked away toward the fog. He studied the cliff again. Something about the rock caught his attention. A small indentation near the edge, like an old crack that had been widened by pressure. He crouched, tracing it with his fingers. Faint but visible along the edge was a rust-colored stain, worked deep into the stone. Mara, he said softly, come here. She hesitated, then stepped closer. When she saw it, her face went pale. Blood? She asked. It could be. Forensics already matched blood on the other side of the cliff to both Daniel and Elias. But this. He looked up at her. This is exactly where you were standing in the photo. Her hands tightened into fists inside her pockets. You? Think I don't know what to think yet, Rowan admitted. But if your hands were on something metallic, maybe it wasn't a weapon. Could have been a climbing spike, a tool, even a piece of equipment. Something you used to try and pull him up. Mara's expression wavered between hope and doubt. If that's true, then where is it? That's what we need to find out. The wind picked up, whipping the fog into moving shapes that seemed to drift closer, curling like fingers. Rowan glanced over his shoulder at the path they'd taken. It suddenly felt narrower, more dangerous. We shouldn't stay here too long, he said. If the tide's coming in and the wind shifts, Rowan... The voice had gone low, almost fearful. She was staring at the scrubby tree line just beyond the cliff path. What is it? I thought I saw someone, she murmured. Just for a second, standing between the trees. Rowan followed her gaze, but the fog blurred everything into shadow. Still, his instincts prickled. We're leaving now. They turned back, moving faster along the path. But halfway to the bend, Rowan slowed, scanning the ground. What is it? Mara asked, her voice tight. Footprints, he said, pointing to the faint depressions in the dirt half filled with moisture, fresh, and not ours. Mara's pulse hammered in her ears. You think we were being followed? Rowan didn't answer. He simply placed a hand on her back and urged her forward. By the time they reached the start of the trail, the footprints had vanished into the rocks. Rowan looked back one last time. The fog was thicker now, almost like it was sealing the cliffs. Off behind them, Mara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite her jacket. When I was little, she said quietly, my dad used to tell me the cliffs could remember things, that they keep echoes of what happened here, even if people forget. Rowan gave her a sidelong glance. Maybe they do, but echoes aren't the same as answers. They walked the rest of the way in silence, the only sound their footsteps on. The damp earth at the trailhead. Rowan paused. Mara, if there's more you haven't told me, there isn't, she interrupted quickly. But the way her gaze darted away told him otherwise. He didn't press her, not yet. Instead, he unlocked the truck and waited until she climbed in. As he started the engine, his mind returned to the blood in the rock, the metallic glint in the photo, and the faint shape Mara swore she saw in the trees. If someone else had been there, that day someone watching it could change everything. Or it could mean Mara was in more danger than either of them realized. The fog swallowed the cliffs. Behind them as they drove away, leaving only the roar of the unseen sea in their wake. Somewhere in the shifting gray, the truth waited, silent, patient, and unfinished. The river below the cliff was a different world dark. Slow-moving in some places, deceptively violent in others.
Ow.
The divers moved with careful precision. There, black wetsuits blending into the shadowed water. Mara stood at the edge of the bank beside Rowan, the damp air heavy with the smell of algae and silt. Every few minutes one of the men surfaced, shaking his head before disappearing beneath the surface again. It was Rowan who broke the silence first. This current, if Daniel fell here, he wouldn't have gone far. Mara swallowed hard, hugging herself. The sun was beginning to dip, the last of the light streaking the water with dying gold, lest the river didn't take him at all. She murmured. By the third hour, a muffled shout came from one of the divers. Mara's pulse jumped. They hauled something up together. First a tangle of weeds, then the unmistakable curve of bone. The remains that emerged were skeletal, skull weathered by years beneath water. The lead diver climbed onto the shore and unzipped his mesh recovery bag. Inside, water pooled around fragments of a rotted jacket and the corroded buckle of a belt. The bones were laid out carefully on a tarp. Rowan crouched, eyes scanning the evidence. These aren't Daniel's clothes, he said quietly. The forensic team confirmed it within hours. The dental records matched Elias. His life had ended here, but the river held no sign of Daniel. For Mara, the revelation was not relief. It was an unsteady, hollow feeling, as though the ground beneath her had shifted, but she hadn't yet fallen. That night, as they left the sheriff's office, the air was thick with the hum of insects. Rowan walked ahead, his voice low. If Elias was down there the whole time, then where's Daniel, and why? He stopped himself, as though speaking the thought aloud might make it too real. By morning, another fracture had formed in the fragile calm. Claire was gone. It began with unanswered calls. Then the cafe she worked at reported she hadn't shown up for her shift. Her house was locked, blinds drawn. No one had seen her car leave. It was as if she had been peeled away. From the town in the middle of the night, Rowan kept pacing the station hallway while deputies knocked on neighbors' doors. Mara sat in a corner chair, hands trembling against her knees. She thought of Claire's voice on their last call strained, distracted and the way she'd said, "We're closer than you think." By evening, the search for Claire had already slowed. Without signs of foul play, the sheriff chalked it up to personal reasons. Rowan disagreed. People don't vanish the day after a body is pulled from the river without it meaning something. Mara barely slept. The house felt colder than it should, every shadow stretching too long. At 2:17 a.m., the sound came a sharp metallic clink against the front door. Like a mailbox flap snapping shut, her chest tightened. She padded to the entryway in bare feet, the floorboards groaning under her weight. Outside, the street was empty. The only movement came from a single moth circling the porch light. When she opened the mailbox, something thin and rigid rested inside a photograph sealed in a plain manila envelope. No note. No markings. Her hands shook as she slid the photo out. It was the image, the one Rowan had shown her from the recovered camera. The last known shot before Daniel disappeared. Only now, something was different. Daniel's expression was no longer calm. His eyes were wide, almost glassy, his mouth twisted in the raw edges of fear. The subtle shift made the entire frame feel unstable, as though the moment before the shutter clicked had stretched into something alive. She dropped into a chair, staring at it under the kitchen light. The background was the same, the cliff edge, the faint smear of clouds, but the fear in his face changed everything she thought she knew. Her mind looped back to the way the sheriff had looked at her earlier that day. The weight in his eyes when he said, "There's still more here than we understand." The silence in the house pressed in, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. She felt watched. Not in the way one feels when someone is physically in the room, but in the deeper, colder way. Like a memory was leaning over her shoulder. Rohan arrived within the hour, hair disheveled, his jacket thrown on over a faded t-shirt. He stood over the table, studying the altered photograph. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "It's the same image, same frame, but this expression, it wasn't there before." "Someone's," he stopped, narrowing his eyes. "Something's changed it." Mara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why send it to me?" Rowan's jaw tightened. "Because they want you to remember something, or because they know you already do." She thought back to the flash of metal in her own hand from that day, the thing she swore she couldn't place. Every time she tried to recall it, her memory seemed to slide away like gripping wet glass. Rowan leaned closer to the photograph, his fingertip hovering just above Daniel's blurred hand. What if this isn't just a picture? What if it's a warning? Mara wanted to ask from who, from where, but her throat felt like it was closing. Outside, a car slowed in front of the house, its headlights sweeping the walls before disappearing down the street. Both of them froze until the sound faded. Rowan finally exhaled. This changes things. We're not just looking for Daniel anymore. We're looking for whoever has the power to rewrite the past. Mara stared at him, the truth dawning in a way that made her skin crawl. If the photograph could change, then so could the story. And if the story could change, then nothing, not even what she had seen with her own eyes, was safe from being reshaped. Somewhere in the dark outside, the river moved with its steady, endless pull, carrying secrets beneath its surface. And for the first time, Mara wondered if Daniel was still out there, not as a body waiting to be found, but as something else entirely. Next chapter will open with Rowan attempting to trace the envelope's origin. It's only to find that the postmark dates back further than Daniel's disappearance. The path to the cliffs felt longer this time. The summer heat had dulled into the cool breath of early autumn, and the air carried the faint scent of pine sap and damp soil. Mara walked slowly, the weight of the recovered camera in her pocket, making every step feel heavier. It had been weeks since the divers brought up Ilias's bones and the town descended into hushed speculation, but no one asked about Daniel anymore. Maybe they didn't want the answer. She knew why she'd come back here. It wasn't for answers, she had those now, though they gnawed at her like rust. It was for something final, something that might stop the echoes. The edge appeared through the thinning trees, the sheer drop yawning open before her like a mouth ready to swallow secrets. The wind tugged at her jacket, pulling her toward it as though the cliff itself remembered her. She stood exactly where she had been all those years ago, her boots finding the shallow impression in the dirt where she had once knelt to tie her shoelace. She could almost hear the click of the camera, feel her father's hand on her shoulder. Mara took the photo from her pocket, the original, the one she'd found in her mailbox after Claire's sudden disappearance. It was the same image burned into her memory, yet different in one cruel, undeniable way. Daniel's eyes. In the old photo, he'd been laughing, teeth bright, hair ruffled by the breeze. But in this version, his mouth was caught mid-breath, and his eyes were wide with a terror so raw it seemed to bleed out of the paper. Someone had been there, capturing not a memory, but a moment of ending. She didn't know if Claire had sent it. She didn't know if Claire had even taken it. It came now. With Claire gone, she never would. The river below roared faintly, carrying with it the restless hiss of water colliding with stone. She tried to picture the divers in the murk, their gloved hands brushing against the skeleton they'd thought might have been Daniel, and to find it wasn't. How Elias had come to rest there, she could piece together. But Daniel. Her breath caught, and she realized she'd been holding it. "I remember now," she said aloud, her voice trembling despite the empty woods around her. She had avoided this thought for years, telling herself the memory had blurred, that the truth had been too tangled to untie. But here, standing in the same place, all unspooled in perfect clarity. The fight had started suddenly. Elias shoving Daniel. Daniel shoving back, their shouts clashing with the rush of the wind. She'd tried to step between them, but their weight was more than she could push against. Elias stumbled toward the edge first. Daniel's hands were at his chest. Single shove, hard and quick. Elias's boots slid, then were gone, swallowed by the cliff. Daniel's eyes had widened then. Not in guilt, but in fear, because he'd seen her. She'd reached for him not to save him, but because instinct told her to stop him, to keep him from moving, from doing something worse. But in that frantic heartbeat, her hands became something else. They became the force that sent him backward. She had felt the slip beneath his heel, had felt his fingers claw at her sleeve before the weight tore away. And then there had been nothing but the wind and the empty space where he had been. She swallowed hard, the memory leaving a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. The truth wasn't a puzzle. It was a wound she'd kept covered so long it had begun to rot. Daniel had killed Elias, and she had killed Daniel. The camera in her hand felt suddenly alive, the metal cold, its surface slick with the sweat from her palm. This was the same. Camera recovered from the locked chest by the fire's uncovering, the same one that had slept for years under dirt and roots, holding its final picture like a clenched fist. The photo inside was more than just evidence, it was a witness. She stepped closer to the cliff's edge. The wind whipped her hair into her face, strands catching in the dampness at the corner of her mouth. Below, the river gleamed in the fading light, its surface breaking into flecks of gold as the sun sank lower. "They'll never know," she said, her voice almost stolen by the breeze. Not all of it. Her father had always told her the cliffs were alive, that the wind carried voices, that the trees leaned to listen. She didn't believe it then. But now, with the pine branches creaking above her and the air shifting in a way that felt deliberate, she wondered if maybe the cliffs had been keeping their own kind of record all along. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Whether it was for Daniel, Elias, or herself, she didn't know. Mara crouched at the edge, looking down into the churn of water and shadow. She held the camera out over the void, the strap slipping through her fingers. The weight of it was almost nothing, now just a piece of plastic and metal that had once meant everything. The wind rose, carrying the scent of rain. The first drops began to fall, speckling her jacket, smudging the ink of the memory she'd been carrying in her head for too long. Somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked, startling a bird into flight. Its wings beat upward as the camera fell. She didn't watch it hit the water. She only listened to the brief silence, then the soft final splash swallowed by the rivers. Endless voice. The rain quickened, pattering against the leaves in a rhythm that matched her pulse. The photo in her other hand, Daniel's terrified face, she let slip next. It twisted in the air like a falling leaf, then vanished into the mist below. Mara straightened, her knees stiff from crouching. The wind pressed against her back, urging her away from the edge. She took a step, then another, each one lighter than the last. Though the weight inside her remained, by the time she reached the tree line, the cliffs were already fading into a gray veil of rain. She didn't look back. Some things didn't deserve a farewell. In town, the lights would be coming on, people drawing their curtains against the storm. Tomorrow, they'd talk about the weather, about Claire's disappearance, maybe about the diver's grim find. But the story, The real story would stay here, where the wind could keep it, where the water could carry it farther than she ever could. Mara paused once at the forest's edge, listening. The rain was heavier now, but beneath it, she thought, she heard something faint, something like the echo of a shutter click. Or maybe it was just the trees, closing in around the last memory. She pulled her hood up and walked on, letting the forest swallow her whole.